Hey everyone, welcome to Time Vault Games. We're going through all of the M21 cards and going color by color. Here we have black, and there's a bunch of cards I'm really excited about. So far, looks to be the best of the bunch. We've got Alchemist's Gift, an instant that gives a creature +1/+1 in either lifelink or death touch. Interesting combat trick for limited, and that is about it there. We've got Archfiends Vessel, a 1/1 for 1. Again, not typically super exciting, so we got to take a look at that upside. Lifelink, not really enough, but when it enters the battlefield from a graveyard, or you cast it from your graveyard, you exile it. If you do, get a 5/5 Black Demon token. A very interesting upside to this card, making it a reanimation target in limited. The token doesn't have lifelink, which is for the best, a 5/5 lifelink flyer, pretty unbeatable in limited, but a 5/5 flyer is really good on its own, so a little bit to set up, but this could be good depending on the type of reanimation effects that we have that may actually be doable in limited. Bad deal, a little bit of a nod to the famous handshake in Predator. Yeah, it is Predator, right? Dylan? Yeah. Hope I got that one right. I don't think it's Commando. I think it's Predator. Anyways, you draw 2 cards and each opponent discards 2 cards. Each player loses 2 life and just kind of swings in the opposite direction there. So you're drawing 2. They're all discarding 2 at 6 mana. It does need to do a lot to be worthwhile and probably not going to be playable in limited at 6 mana. That's just an awful lot. Though there are times this feels a lot like Probe back in the day, which was really good. There was a card in Invasion, Probe. It was like draw 3 and discard 2, and then if you kicked it, then I think they discarded cards. It was pretty brutal. So this could be playable. I don't know. Let me know what you think about this one in the comments. Toward turn 6, when they've only got a few cards left in their hand, that's pretty devastating. Drawing 2 cards could be pretty good. I don't know. You might actually sleeve this one up in a sealed deck. Blood Glutton, a 5 casting cost, 4/3 lifelink. We've seen a lot of synergy with life gain so far, and the magic number seems to be at least 3 life gain, so this would satisfy that condition. And for synergy reasons, that could be very interesting. 4/3 lifelink in general, not terrible. The trading down, a big deal, but black's got a lot of removal, so maybe totally fine there. Cage Zombie, a 3-mana 2/3. And you can pay 2 and tap it for each opponent to lose 2 life, only if a creature died this turn. Gives you some breakthrough. I'm not sure what this format's going to look like as far as standstills. There's been many limited formats which just become standstills, and any way that you can break that ends up being incredibly good. If that's the case, this could be much higher value. If the format is just really a race, then this probably becomes much, much worse, given the subpar stats being a 2/3 for 3. Carryin Grub. 4 mana, 0 power creatures. Not the most exciting. It gets +X+O, where X is the greatest power among creatures cards in your graveyard. So that's actually a pretty big upside when things work. And when it enters the battlefield, mill 4. So this is potentially in a deck full of fatties, potentially a 5/5 for 4, which is incredible when it works. When it doesn't work, it's a complete disaster. This may be a manageable risk. A 40-card deck, milling 4, if you do have a bunch of good creatures, and that could actually get better over time. So this is an interesting one. I'm surprised they didn't template it differently with a star like they have in the past for character-defining attributes. I guess this isn't setting the power and toughness, so it's actually going to be a bonus. I get it now. Doing this in one take, guys. Sometimes it takes a little while to catch up. We got Crypt Lurker, 4 mana for a 3/4. When it enters the battlefield, you can sacrifice a creature or discard a creature card. If you do, draw a card. Potential way to stock the graveyard with reanimation targets. Overall, those stats are not the worst in the world. 3/4s are pretty powerful and limited. The backside is going to be able to survive smaller creatures and potentially force 2-for-1 trades, which can get completely out of hand with removal. Deathbloom Thallid, a 3/2 for 3. When it dies, you get that 1/1 green sapling creature. probably not good enough for Pauper Aristocrats. I believe this might be a reprint, actually. Overall, the fact that you get the extra bodies, a nice upside. Wouldn't be embarrassed to play this in a sealed deck, but not the most exciting card. Demonic Embrace. So Black's actually got a card here that could be playable given the recursion. So typically the problem with enchantments for you newer players is you got this great plan, you're going to slap this enchantment on your creature and you're just going to go to town, and instead your opponent responds by killing the creature with one of their cards, getting rid of both the enchantment and the creature. Total disaster. You're probably just losing. Those type of things either drag out over time to the point where they've got more cards than you, or the tempo loss is just a complete disaster because you've lost the mana cost from the Demonic Embrace that you've invested, plus the creature, and it's just an absolute wreck. This gives the creature +3/+1 and flying, and you can cast it from your graveyard by paying 3 life and discarding a card, essentially turning any one of the cards in your hand into a Demonic Embrace if it ends up in the graveyard. I think this card's very, very dangerous. You could put this on a 2 casting cost creature and start swinging for 5 on turn 3, potentially 6 with some of the 3/1s for 2. And this is one of the few times that I'd actually be interested in an enchantment in Limited, given that even if there is a blowout, you're going to be able to make it stick eventually. They can only have so much removal, and the fact that it gives it flying makes it much more difficult to trade with. This one, I can definitely see people losing to on pre-release weekend. Duress, classic card. I was very surprised to see how often this card has been reprinted. It's a big vintage card, and I remember in the Dragons of Tarkir pre-release, I was actually playing against somebody that knew me from Vintage. They knew I have full power and everything, and would always try and get people to play Vintage. We do proxy events and stuff, and let people borrow decks, etc. And he let out with a turn 1 Duress, and I thought he was making a joke. I thought he was like pretending like we were playing Vintage at the pre-release. And then I looked, and I was like, oh wow, that's actually a Duress. So not usually the type of thing that you want to play in Limited. Very often it will whiff. Your opponent could have just a really good hand with lands and creatures. The removal tends to be at a really high premium, but again, you may whiff with this card, so you're probably not going to sleeve it up in Limited, but it's a heck of a card for Constructed at any level. Eliminate is a very interesting printing. So Smother is the creature side of this card. Instant for 2 mana, destroy a creature with mana cost 3 or less. This also gets Planeswalkers, and some of those 3 casting cost Planeswalkers are real problems. I'm looking at you, Narset, Lilianas that costs 3. Not so much Baby Jace anymore, but Oko, Renin 6 if it's in the format that you're playing. So this card could definitely see Constructed play, and a very interesting printing. I think this one's, it's definitely not broken. You've got Abrupt Decay, which can do the same thing, but for decks that don't have green and also have black, so all the non-green black decks, this is definitely a possibility for Constructed. That very narrow circumstance. Fetid Imp, a 2 mana 1/2 flying, pay a black, gains Death Touch until end of turn. Not a whole lot to look at there. I guess it can trade up. Hitting for 1 turn generally just doesn't add up to enough damage. Back on this Eliminate, formats that don't have Abrupt Decay, this card's probably hot sauce. There's just not that many formats I care about that you can't play Abrupt Decay. Finishing Blow, strictly limited. 5 mana, destroy a creature or planeswalker is potentially playable. It's a lot of mana, but killing creatures is really important. There's better creature removal, but creature removal is usually not embarrassing to sleeve up as a general rule. And this is an instant, which isn't the end of the world. You can potentially get some value responding to an enchantment. So this card's probably going to be playable in sealed. Might be too slow for a good draft deck, but I've certainly played worse in my draft decks in the past and managed to sweep the draft. Gloom Sower, this is a big creature. 8/6 for 7. When it becomes blocked by a creature, that creature's controller loses 2 and you gain 2, so it's a form of evasion. Doesn't completely get over there, it basically kind of tramples over just 2 damage, but you also gain the 2 life, which is nice. So very interesting card for limited. At 7 mana, that's really the top of the curve. That's as expensive a card as you're ever going to want in a sealed deck for the most part. 7 is so much to ask, but very interesting. I don't think it's good enough for Pauper, but this is a pretty big creature where if you're actually staring across the table at this, you are not doing well. Gorman, a 6 mana 5/5 flyer. As an additional cost, you have to sacrifice a creature, and when it enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a creature. This is potentially fine and limited depending on the types of creatures that you're having to sacrifice. It is probably a bigger drawback than it looks like, given that there are many games where you literally have no creatures in hand, and those are in play, and that's a disaster. When you're sitting there with a couple of Gormans in hand and just not able to cast anything, just absolutely getting wrecked. That is a total blowout, and that's the type of thing you got to look for. For new players, when you're assessing cards, one thing you want to think about is how the card works in the worst case scenarios, and that's going to really kind of counterbalance the initial thought process that most people get. Usually when people see cards, they start to think about all the ways that things can go right, and what you really need to do to counterbalance that is think, okay, what can make this card absolutely terrible? And right there, right off the bat, if you literally don't even have another creature, then this is terrible. If all you have is another Gorman, doesn't do anything to cast it, you're just killing one to get another one. I guess you get that extra sack trigger, but still not exactly where you want to be. You're going to want smaller creatures to sacrifice to this thing, which is very on flavor for demons. Grasp of Darkness, super high value draft pick here. -4/-4 is going to handle most of the stuff in the format for only 2 mana, and this is a very dangerous card, able to handle the entire low end of the curve and a lot of the high end cards as well. Also has the ability, even if a creature's like a 5/5, to potentially shrink it and create a favorable combat situation. So this one definitely going to be a beating in limited. Grim Tudor, here we go. This is the one that everybody's been talking about. It is a very bold reprint. We'll see how this goes as far as the market value of Grim Tudor. I am pretty much going to judge the value of the quality of this reprint based off of how things go. I think Commander players are going to want this card, and if that's the case and they start playing it, then great. If this ends up being the type of card that doesn't really see that much play, then that's going to be a pretty frustrating reprint if it tanks the value of the original. I'm not entirely against reprints that end up devaluing cards as long as there's a big upside. I think you have to take care of the people that are invested in the game as well as the people who are coming to the table for those first few times. And a card like Grim Tudor, if somebody's invested heavily to get that for their commander deck, I hate to see the value go down for no reason. And hopefully this card sees play and people actually want the original even more. Hopefully it becomes a staple that people are very much in favor of playing in Commander, and the originals end up going up in value. That would be kind of a win all the way around, where people would get access to the new card and the original version would become the prestige version, despite these masterpieces, which they did do a nice job of, all the showcase frames and stuff. Hooded Blightfang, a 3-mana 1/4 with Death Touch. Whenever a creature you control with Death Touch attacks, each opponent loses 1 and you gain 1. And whenever a creature you control with Death Touch deals damage to a Planeswalker, you destroy it, essentially giving it a Planeswalker Death Touch. So, totally fine. I mean, it's a rare, so you should probably be happy when you open it and it's on color. The Death Touch in essentially a 2/4 with lifelink-ish. If you have a bunch of Death Touch, this could get completely out of hand, although I don't expect Death Touch Tribal to be much of a thing. And being able to clear Planeswalkers in a single hit is preferable. I mean, cards like Oko, where you're just crashing into it repeatedly and it's not going anywhere, are certainly frustrating. I don't think this would be good enough for Constructed, but certainly in Limited, you're going to be really happy when you open this if you're already in black. Infernal Scarring. This is a reprint. It gives a creature +2/+0, and when it dies, you draw a card. It's an enchantment. Feels like it'd be way better if it had flashed, and at least you could guarantee the card draw. It is what it is. I mean, it pumps your guy up and it replaces itself. I think this probably ends up being a trap most of the time, something that you want to play on early drops, and your opponent can eventually stabilize. Could be better on creatures with flying or evasion. But just in general, it's nice that they're trying to address the drawback of enchantments. But at the end of the day, they certainly can lead to some really disappointing game states. Kyric the Spiteful. This card's gross. -1/-1. All other creatures, control strategies. I would not be surprised if this sees play in Constructed, in a creature light control strategy. I don't know that there's enough support for that, but there has been in the past. And I mean, that's just a big effect. -1/-1 is half of an Elish Norn. I mean, Elish Norn is -2/-2, and it basically just invalidates all of your opponent's strategies. And this is halfway there for like half the mana cost. And I think this one's probably Constructed playable. In Limited, if you have it in your deck, you're going to need to build around it. You probably don't want to have anything that's just going to die to Kyric being played. But this is a really oppressive effect that affects all other creatures and could be fun to build around. Kitesail Freebooter, a reprint, and I don't know how needed it was. I'm not sure how difficult it was to get a copy of Freebooter. But there'll certainly be more of them in circulation now, and this is basically like a Mesmeric Fiend. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-creature, non-land card, and then exile that card until Freebooter leaves the battlefield. So there's no trigger to return it. So there's not as many tricks as you can do with Mesmeric Fiend, but this card sees play in humans and is Constructed quality. Thank goodness OBS has the pause feature now. Liliana Deathmage, a 6-mana Planeswalker deck, Planeswalker. This one's not the worst as far as those Planeswalkers go. Of course, they're generally not going to be Constructed playable. Occasionally, one of them will sneak into Commander. But +1 to return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Little underwhelming. -3 to destroy a creature. Its controller loses 2 life. Would be amazing if this was in a booster pack. If you were able to get this in sealed, you'd be totally fine paying 6 mana to destroy a creature, make them lose 2 life, and also have a Planeswalker kicking around where you could just keep returning chump blockers. And then -7, target opponent loses 2 life for each creature card in their graveyard is a very likely finisher. So if this was in the set, it'd be something that you'd be totally fine getting, but it's not. It's just in the Planeswalker deck, so just for the casual play, and I think people will probably have fun with this one. This one will actually do things. With some of the Planeswalkers just kind of spin their wheels. This one has a nice flavor and a reasonable power level for beginners. Liliana's Devotee. Zombies you control get +1/+0. It's a human warlock, so may or may not fit into your zombie tribal commander strategies, depending on how heavy on the zombie theme you are. And at the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, you can pay 2 to put a 2/2 black zombie token into play. So really, it just depends on what you're looking for out of your casual zombie deck. For Constructed, I don't know. I mean, it is a lot of creature generation potentially, but I'm not sure if that would be the most efficient way to do that in, say, Standard, for example. Maybe there'll be some type of casual Standard deck that uses that. Liliana's Scorn. Destroy target creature. You can search your library for that Planeswalker Liliana and put it into your hand and then shuffle your library. So 5 mana to destroy a creature and get the Liliana is a card that people will have fun with in that Planeswalker deck. The Scrounger. This one's also from the Planeswalker deck. At the beginning of each end step, if a creature died this turn, you can put a loyalty counter on your Liliana, really ramping her up, and people probably won't be cutting that card in any hurry from those Planeswalker decks. They actually give you a booster pack with it. I'm not sure if it'll be 1 or 2 in these ones, but all of the Planeswalker decks come with boosters, so you can upgrade, and this is probably a card that you will not be cutting. Liliana's Standardbearer, back to the cards actually in the booster packs. Standardbearer has Flash, 3/1 for 3, and when it enters the battlefield, draw X cards, where X is the number of creatures that have died under your control this turn. That's an interesting card. I mean, you can do some pretty unfortunate things, post-blocking, letting a bunch of creatures die, reloading. This card, I could imagine seeing constructed play. The flash makes it a good fit for control decks to be able to use during your opponent's end step. And of course, you can just play it on your turn if you've wiped the board to reload your hand. So this one may have some constructed possibilities, and I would certainly sleeve it up in limited as well. Even if you're drawing a couple of cards off of that, it's probably fine. And the fact that it's a flash 3/1 can actually make a mess of things during the end step. There are times in limited where your opponent swings, kind of calculating what the crackback would be, and you could potentially just totally blow out your opponent. And then worst case scenario, you've got a 3-power creature for 3, which is not the worst. Lillianas Steward, a 1-mana 1/2 that you can tap and sack to make an opponent discard a card. Anytime you could play a sorcery. I mean, maybe there's some type of pauper deck that's going to want this, some type of recursion with this guy. The fact that you can only do it during a sorcery prevents any type of shenanigans during the draw step before their first main. I would say if this is going to see play, pauper would probably be the place. And it seems like a fine printing. It's definitely flavorful, and no major complaint there. Liliana, Waker of the Dead. So at 4 mana, we've got 4 loyalty. Each player discards a card when you +1 her. If they can't, then they lose 3 life, which is nice. Very often in Liliana's end with your opponent being hellbent. The -3 gives a creature -X/-X, where X is the number of cards in your graveyard. A pretty reasonable expectation of killing anything on the board with that by the time you're getting this Planeswalker out. And an ultimate that probably wins the game. You get an emblem where at the beginning of combat you can return a creature from the graveyard to the battlefield under your control and give it haste. So this card at 4 mana, probably a good standard Planeswalker, I would imagine. I think it gets pushed out for things like Legacy. I don't know if there's going to be a control deck in Pioneer that would actually be happy with this, but it could possibly be a sideboard card versus control strategies. It's a big threat. I mean, you're going after their hand every single turn and also killing creatures. What this card does is very, very good. It's really a question of the casting cost being at 4 instead of 3, and whether or not that's going to be worthwhile compared to the other Lilianas and the other options at that mana cost. For limited, the card's probably just ridiculous. Malefic Scythe. When it enters the battlefield, it has a soul counter, and equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each soul counter on it. And when the equipped creature dies, you put a counter. So it essentially just snowballs. As your creatures die, they get better and better. It equips for 1, which prevents a lot of potential combo shenanigans that might happen with this. I mean, a +1/+1 for 2, 3 overall. And this could probably be playable in limited. That's about all I've got to say about that. There's possibly some commander decks that would enjoy this type of effect. Masked Blackguard, a flash 2/1 for 2, and you can pump it for 3 to give it +1/+1. It's an expensive pump effect. 2 mana 2/1s are certainly playable in limited very often. This pump effect is probably going to be mostly about not using it. The nice thing about pump effects, you got to remember, is you can swing with a card like this into, say, a 4/3 or a 5/4, and they may just not be blocking depending on how this game is going. You can basically get in there, attack, so they don't want to block, and then you don't have to invest the mana, because the 6 mana to make it do 2 extra damage, not necessarily worth it, unless it's actually hitting a creature and trading or even surviving. But the threat of doing that potentially gives it evasion. So this 2/1 with a quasi-invasion is probably the way to look at this card. If they've got a 1/1 and you swing, they're not going to be wanting to block it unless their guy has Death Touch. Ooh, speaking of the touch of death, Massacre Worm just ruins games. Like, just completely wrecks Commander games. The -2/-2 would be bad enough, but whenever an opponent's creature dies, they lose 2 life. I've seen countless Commander players just devastated by this card as they've got a whole army of saprolings or squirrels. Thank goodness for that pause feature. Just had a lovely family come in and pick up some Fireball Island. That is a good one if you're looking for something not magic to spend time with during this shutdown. Massacre Worm, I think I said everything that needs to be said. Crushing Dreams, Killing Weenies, brutal card. Definitely gonna be playing it in Limited, in Commander, in Constructed. This card's an absolute beating. Mind Rot, 3 mana for target player to discard 2 cards. Not super exciting historically. These type of cards, not usually very good in Limited. I've heard of people kind of taking this as a valid strategy. I just don't see it. I think you get steamrolled trying to go after their hand. And it's one of those cards that gets much worse against better players when they will hold on to lands to not get blown out by a card like Mind Rot. So, I mean, I'd rather have my best games versus the best players and not just dunk on people that I would have beaten anyways. Necromentia, a 3 mana card. This is a take on a popular mechanic. Choose a name other than a basic land and then search their hand, graveyard, and library for any number of cards with the name and exile them. And then that player shuffles their library and creates a 2/2 black zombie for each card from their hand exiled this way. So you pretty thoroughly get rid of all copies of the card and potentially give them some zombies. If you did want to upgrade your Squadron Hawks, I suppose you could do that, but you're not realistically going to be doing that. This is really trying to go after a key card in your opponent's deck, and if they've got a single win condition, for example, this is devastating. The last time this was good was Cranial Extraction. That was a Kamigawa block, and it was literally the best thing you could do in that block constructed era. Just stripping out the handful of win conditions that your opponent had. The fact that this gives them a win condition does try and offset that a little bit. This is also only 3 mana, so recursion on a card like this can be very crippling, and I would not be surprised if this ends up seeing some type of constructed play in some way. Obviously terrible for Commander, as it only gets the single copy. I mean, I suppose it's possible that your opponent's going to have... Extract exists. So for 1 blue mana, you can just get the card out of their deck. So I can't justify this in Commander no matter how hard I try. Peer into the Abyss. This is an exciting one, guys. 7 mana. Win the game, right? Target player draws cards equal to half the number of cards in their library. What kind of deck are you playing that you don't win when you draw half of it and you're casting a card like this? This can be ritualed out and could be a Burning Wish target in Storm decks for Legacy. This could potentially be reason to consider Burning Wish in that type of shell. The 2 mana tutors are very powerful, and of course the drawback historically of a 2 mana Burning Wish situation was it didn't get the card into your graveyard, so you weren't able to go get a Past in Flames and just kill them in one go. I don't know. I think this is worth considering as a sideboard slot in that style deck. Maybe we'll see some evolution in terms of the way mana works in those decks as well. But this is a heck of an effect. It's also possible that Omniscience decks could use Burning Wish to go get this card, as this gives essentially another way of winning once you have Omniscience out. Overall, super high power level. I'm excited to see how this one actually ends up being played at the table. Pestilent Hayes, 3 mana to give all creatures -2/2, or to take a couple loyalty counters off of a Planeswalker, a perhaps slightly better Drown in Sorrow style effect. We've had 3 mana to do -2 to everything in many, many printings. I think it's possible that this ends up being playable as 3 mana to do -2 to everything historically has been just fine. And being able to get rid of some loyalty from a Planeswalker is a nice upside. Rise Again, 5 mana to return a creature card from your graveyard to your battlefield. Reanimate, but instead of losing the life, you have to pay 4 more mana. Not really feeling this one. I can't really think of any use. I don't know if it's a reprint or if it's just a if it's downshifted. It's common, so I don't think Pauper actually needs this effect. They've got Exhume. They definitely want more Exhumes, but 5 mana, I mean, that's a lot to ask. Sanctum of Stone Fangs. At the beginning of your pre-combat, each opponent loses a life and you gain a life, is basically what this card reads, unless you have more shrines. This type of effect can be pretty difficult to outrace. And if you have multiple shrines, I mean, this is a very serious win condition. At 2 mana, this is an interesting card. I mean, we've seen Subversion at like 5 mana see play at commander tables, so this shrine, I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up seeing some play. In multiplayer games, it can also let you gain a bunch of life, which can potentially set up some of these other cards that care about gaining life in a single turn. Sanguine Indulgence costs 3 less to cast if you've gained 3 or more life this turn. Return up to 2 target creatures from your graveyard to your hand. I mean, 1 mana to get 2 creatures back is very good, so if you're in a deck that's going to consistently do that, that could be very spicy. Yeah, that's about it on this one. It's a nice little form of card advantage that's very conditional and potentially very efficient. Silver Smoke Ghoul, a 3 mana 3/1, and at the beginning of your end step, if you've gained 3 or more, you can return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped, and you can also sack it to draw a card. This seems just like gravy in any deck that can be gaining life. I would say this is a very just a pain in the butt and limited to deal with. The fact that this could just keep coming back and creating an unbelievable amount of value. I really like the fact that you can pay 2 and sack it to draw a card, so if your opponent does try and target it with removal, like let's say they've got a 3/3 that they really want to get through, that just feels awful. Like, you're going to target this and they can sack it in response. This is a pretty sticky card, and I think this would be very, very good in limited as long as you've got the ability to gain that life. Skeleton Archers. I really like this card in limited. 4 mana for a 3/3 is somewhat respectable, but a point of damage to any target can really create some serious card advantage and stop the storm of incoming weenies. When you're talking about X1s all over the place, there are some 3/1s for 2 in this set, and this guy's just out for blood. I would be happy to be playing this card in my sealed deck at pre-release. Spirit of Malevolence. When it dies, each opponent loses a life and you gain a life. 2 mana, 2/1. In draft, this type of thing can be a valid strategy. That's got a nice little upside. Creates a little bit of inevitability if you have multiple of them. Just give you a little bit of extra range even if they stabilize. This card seems totally medium. Tavern Swindler, another 2 mana, 2 power creature. This one you can pay 3 life, flip it, and if you win, gain 6 life. This sets up a lot of your life gain situations, so this is probably going to be playable, totally playable in sealed. It's a properly costed creature that has an upside that's more relevant in this set than I believe it has been. It is a reprint in this. The fact that you can gain life off of it is very interesting, and I mean, I think that's a reasonable risk to take. It's going to average out just fine in the end. Thieves Guild Enforcer. Flash. Whenever Thieves Guild Enforcer or another rogue enters the battlefield, each opponent mills 2, and as long as an opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard, it gets buffed. You're going to be very happy to have this along with other rogues, being able to mill your opponent out. If there's other support that you've got, this could be really good. Otherwise, milling in limited, not really that big a deal unless you actually kill your opponent by milling them. That's something to remember for you casual players or your new players to tournament play. When you're milling your opponent, it does not matter. unless you actually kill them. That card could have been on the bottom of the library. Like, there's functionally no difference in between taking 2 cards off the top of their library and putting it on the bottom versus putting it into the graveyard, assuming that they can't use it. It might actually help them by putting it in the graveyard. But people often really overvalue the idea of putting cards into the graveyard because they feel like they've killed that card, and you're just as likely to be drawing them into the thing that actually can win them the game than getting rid of the card. So it doesn't actually matter which cards are going where. It's all random off the top. Of course, it does matter once you start getting into things that put cards on top of their library, if they have something like that. If there's a known interaction, but if you're just randomly taking 2 cards off the top of their library, it's very similar to just shuffling their library, which is not really an effect you're going to pay very much for. Village Rites, this is a super exciting card. I think this might be like the most exciting card for me. I can't wait to try this in Zubera Storm. If you haven't seen that deck, check it out. It's on the YouTube channel. It is a wacky pauper combo deck, and you sacrifice Zuberas over and over and over again to draw tons of cards and eventually kill your opponent with a different Zubera. And this could fit right into that deck. Drawing 2 cards for 1 black feels very, very spicy. Could also see some play in some Aristocrats decks. The fact that it's only 1 mana, draws 2, and is an instant makes this an excellent reply to removal, and I am overall super excited about this card. It's definitely on my top 10 list for this set in terms of things I'm excited to play with. Veto, Thorn of the Dusk Rose. Whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life, and you can give all creatures you control lifelink, a possible commander, a very powerful effect for 3 mana that can be used in all sorts of wacky combos, and I expect casual players to be very excited about this card. The 1/3 is probably for the best, as it kind of lets the shenanigans continue. It's, if you're playing some type of wacky combo, then let's not end the game before things actually come together. Walking Corpse, just a vanilla reprint, 2/2 zombie for 2, possibly going to be playable. Most of the bears in this set have an upside. At least this one is a 2/2 compared to a 2/1 and is less easily destroyed. Witch's Cauldron, 1 mana artifact. You can pay 2, sack a creature to gain a life and draw a card. As a interesting reply to any type of removal. I'd love it if damage stacked. For those unfamiliar, damage used to go on the stack. Basically, now the only way to take advantage of something like this would be, if you had a creature with first strike after it dealt damage. It's tough to imagine when this would really be like super exciting outside of as a reply to removal. I mean, which is a thing that happens, but you're probably not going to be super happy about playing this, given that you have to sack a creature just to replace itself, sack another one just to get ahead. So you're kind of always behind a card, barring some type of creature generation. And the 1 life is really just a pittance. If they'd let you gain the 3 life to turn on all of your cards that care about life gain, this would have been a very different printing. And I'm curious if it actually worked that way in testing. And that brings us back around. All right, well, this was a long one. Thanks for watching, guys. We're going to be doing the rest of the colors each day, and then at the end, I'm going to do a roundup of my favorites. And thanks for watching.